So to put the official start on it, this is an interview with Susan Gerhart from her own company, APODder. Is that the way to say it?
Yeah, apodder.org is basically a website name for the activities I'm doing.
Okay, and we'll talk more about that. This interview is being conducted by Vicki Almstrum. This interview is being recorded on March, today is the 10th, 2008, in Austin, Texas, at the University of Texas at Austin. It is part of the Computing Educators Oral History Project. Did we give and pronounce your name correctly?
Say it again.
Susan Gerhart.
That sounds good.
All right. So I'd like to start from your youth, your roots, and ask about your parents. Did they have college degrees, the type of support that they gave you growing up?
My father grew up during the Depression era, and he was a scholarship student at Kenyon College for a couple of years, but he never graduated. And Kenyon College was a liberal arts college right next to in the nearby town where he grew up.
And that town was?
Mount Vernon, Ohio.
Okay.
And my mother never had college education. And she had worked in drugstores. In Utica, Ohio was the town where I grew up.
So they had high school education?
Yes.
And your dad a couple of years beyond that?
Of college, right.
And what was your dad's field?
He was an accountant for Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company in Mount Vernon, manufacturing glass, sheet glass.
And you mentioned your mother worked for drugstores. What did she do for them?
A clerk.
Okay. So it was not the medical side of it or the prescriptions.
Right.
It was the more
retail.
Right. Okay.
And in a family-owned drugstore before the days of chains.
Yeah. Way back before chains.
Yeah.
So your father had some mathematical leanings since he was doing accounting.
Yeah.
And self-taught essentially after high school, or the college he had was enough to help him?
Actually, I believe he probably got his accounting training during the war, during World War II. So he was in the South Pacific as in the Army, basically keeping track of equipment, things like that. So I think he probably got most of his accounting training in the military.
So how long was he in the military?
Probably 3 years.
And was this before or after you had come onto the scene?
He was shipped out the night that I was born.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, my.
So I don't think he saw me until I was 2 years old, basically.
So your mother had a period of being a single parent.
Well, she was living with her parents and my aunt and uncle at that time.
So you really had extended family as part of your early days.
Yeah.
Do you think that those family members had... Part of where I want to go is the influence that your parents had, but since there's such close extended family ties, it could be interesting to hear what mathematical or scientific background they had that might have helped influence you.
Let's see, my aunt probably had the most influence there, and she was also in, I don't know if you'd call it accounting, but she ended up running the business office for a rural electrification company, and nothing in particular mathematical there, but she was, my aunt, was a very exploratory person, go fishing and things but there was nothing that was mathematical in the family background there particular. Yeah.
So you went to school for how long in Ohio?
My entire elementary and junior high and senior high was in the same town in Utica, Ohio, and then I went to college at Ohio Wesleyan, which was about 45 minutes away from the town where I grew up.
Were you a good student?
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, the valedictorian type thing, yeah.
Were you very active in other areas?
In music, in the band, and orchestra.
What instruments did you play?
Flute and piccolo. And some of I believe there was a science, I think something like a science club and science fairs and things like that. Girl Scouts, 4-H.
Oh, 4-H.
You remember that?
Oh,
right?
yes. So what did you do in 4-H? Which areas?
I actually sewed a blouse once. And I think that led, I don't remember whether the 4-H led to it, but led to a summer job, actually, at a 4-H camp, washing dishes, you know. But that gave me sort of my first job in being an assistant at a summer camp nearby.
About how old were you then?
Probably about 16, 17.
So as you went through elementary and junior and senior high school, what are your memories about the math and the science that you studied?
We had a very good high school math teacher, 2 or 3 good math teachers. One in particular that I can remember. Now, there's a significant event that occurred here, which was Sputnik, and that occurred, what was the year, 1957?
Was it 57, yeah.
57, and so I graduated from high school in 61. So after Sputnik, there was a much greater emphasis on math and science. And I think unlike today, it was much more effective. It was really very concentrated. And so math teachers they weren't gods, but they were much more respected and had much more responsibility to help the next generation. And there was the new math was coming along at that time, which was basically set theory. So the math teachers really had the chance to do, I think, a lot more with the students that they could pick out as ones that would be good, you know, for math and science.
Were your math and science classes tracked in any way so that there was a special line for honor students and a separate one for others?
There was a college prep, and then there were a couple of us we had a chance to take a calculus course, basically, you know, as a sort of an individual study type calculus course given by the math teacher. But this was a fairly small high school, so there were not a whole lot of tracks.
So what size was the high school?
Probably the graduating class was about 100, and this was at the time that many high schools were being merged, very small schools were being merged together into a larger school. So there were people coming from different communities nearby, you know, within about a 10 or 15 mile range, so that these were consolidating high school districts.
Okay. Were there any of your teachers through elementary, junior high, and high school who were especially significant, or another administrator at the school?
Yeah. The Latin teacher was particularly, I think, particularly dynamic. She was a very remote person in many ways. She you know, had silver hair and she looked like a Latin teacher in many ways. But she worked us hard. And of course, I remember no Latin now, but it was probably a more rigorous course than some of the others I had. And a physics teacher who was young. I think this was like his first job right out of college, and he was very proactive and took me to a science fair. And then the math teacher that I mentioned, who also was fairly young and was trying to do the new math thing. What was new math?
Was this a man or a woman?
Man.
Okay.
So the only female high school teacher that I can remember having much effect was the Latin teacher. Most of the teachers were male. Then the principal of the high school, who again was probably on his first or second job, who became the principal of the high school, was very supportive, and he was the one he was a graduate of Ohio Wesleyan, and he kind of steered me, he and his wife steered me in that direction, mainly from lack of other choices. I mean, I had no idea where to apply to college. Ohio State, and then was kind of the default school, and then Ohio Wesleyan was a liberal arts college because I got a scholarship there. That was the choice that worked.
Before we move more into the college stuff, let's talk a little bit about your siblings. You have a brother, I know. Mm-hmm. Do you have any other siblings besides that brother?
2 brothers, yeah.
Okay. And so where are you?
I'm the oldest.
You're the oldest, and so 2 younger brothers.
Yeah.
And what were your interactions with them over the years?
Well, the one was 3 years younger, 3 or 4 years younger, and then the other's 8 years younger, and he's the youngest one is the one who, I have been helping to raise his children, and we've been sort of co-parents for about 15 years of his children, so that relationship remained close. Significant thing was that my mother was ill with lupus for essentially from the time that my younger brother was born until she died at age 62. So in our youth, we were sort of trying to take care of our parents as well as ourselves, as they taking care of us.
So that added a lot of responsibility for you as a child.
Yes, and it made it difficult for my parents to do as much for us as I think they would have liked to do, although they certainly did quite a lot.
So once your father returned from the war, your family was in its own home, not quite as intimately with the extended family as during the time he was overseas.
That's right. I mean, it was a separate household, but in a small town, everything was within blocks.
Mm-hmm. So you had a lot of closeness to family over the years.
To my maternal family, particularly. Yeah.
Did either of your brothers follow a mathematical or scientific path through high school and on into college?
No, not really.
No. So do you think that you had the same educational training and were sort of reinforced in the same way for your career aspirations as your brothers?
I think I probably got more from my parents in encouragement, from my parents in terms of college, because I was just a very good student. It was kind of obvious which route that should take, whereas my brothers were more, iffy on the scholarly side of things. But the high school that I went to, and now in talking about this with you, I realized that one of the effective things may have been there that so many of the teachers and the principal were early on in their careers, with the exception of the Latin teacher. So they were, not so much trying to make a mark for themselves, but they were much more maybe receptive and fresh in the teaching that they were doing. And because they were young in their careers themselves, they were looking for one or two good students that, they could push along and claim, claim as successes. And because it was a small school, there wasn't a whole lot of competition there.
You mentioned both Girl Scouts and 4-H. Were those influences, as well as church or any other activities that you did, formative in taking you towards what you became eventually?
I just don't remember that much of those two. No.
No?
It certainly, broadened the activities that I did, but there was not anything that I remember that contributed specifically to science or technology careers.
I can glean from what you've said that there weren't so many outside activities at the high school itself. There was band that you mentioned, but there weren't the proliferation of clubs and activities that exist now.
I think that's true. I think that partially because this was at a consolidation time, that the clubs were not as in existence, but also that it was just small. It would be very hard to get together enough students to even make a band.
Interesting.
Some people got drafted to be trombone, and they didn't want to be trombone, but the band leader had to find enough people to give him a full scale distribution across the instruments.
Yep. That doesn't sound the same if there are no trombones. Let's see. So on to your undergraduate education. You've talked a little bit about why you chose Ohio Wesleyan.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything else about that?
It was primarily the influence of the principal, the proximity but distance of 45 minutes was enough so that I wouldn't pop home all the time, and I lived pretty much like most of the students on the campus, but I wasn't that far from home in terms of travel expense, and the scholarships that were available to me. There's one important event happened here right after high school, and probably this was set up where the information was provided by the high school itself. I had the opportunity to go to a National Science Foundation summer institute for high school students. It was, I think, juniors and seniors, and that was at Southern Illinois University. And again, this was in the Sputnik. We got to have more scientists and engineers and defeat the Russians and the Cold War type of mentality that there was a sense of urgency there. And so in that program, I don't know, I took some science program, physiology or something. I don't remember. But I also had a computing course. So this was in 1961. And this was a course taught by the summer institute courses were taught by regular college professors, and they were not dumbed down, but shorter courses and geared toward high school students, getting high school students interested in math and science. And we basically learned how to program an IBM 650. So there were about maybe 10 students in this class. And this was, at the very beginning of time with respect to learning how to program. I don't even remember what language it was, but it was probably, a Fortran or a Fortran dialect. It might have been assembly language. But we had to program a few loops, and that really drew me in. That was a moment, where I got hooked, because just the sense that you could program a loop that could do, an array of any number, any size, any number of numbers, just seemed to be such a fantastic thing. And though I didn't realize it as much at the time, but the other side of that question is, so you can add up all the numbers, how do you know you got the right answer, which became the basis for my later career of program correctness. So being able to program, it just seemed to me like the most natural thing in the world. Programming, I just took to programming, and I had that introduction, and then whatever problems were assigned were ones that were interesting enough and hooked me, and we got our hands on a machine. I don't remember, must have been punch cards, and we ran our programs, and we were hands-on, and that was the defining moment probably in my career. And from that, when I went to college, then it was natural to move on to math, being the closest thing. So that was an important, the most important point, the defining point. And that goes back, I think very interestingly, to the effects of Sputnik and the startup of these National Science Foundation summer programs, and then having some college teachers drafted into or given the opportunity to teach those courses, and having the availability of the computer.
Sounds like it was significant. So when you arrived at college, you knew math was the direction you were going, it sounds like.
Well, math, mainly by virtue of being the closest thing to computing. I never really liked calculus and differential equations. And later on in my career, when I was had the opportunity to learn logic and set theory, that was the branches of just more discrete math was what I liked. And then statistics too. There were statistics courses. But as I was in college, the chair of the math department there was very forward thinking, and he got in a computer, an IBM 1620, which for students to use, but it was also it was the IT machine. It was the computer on campus. And I don't know whether he got it by donation or the school bought it. But again, by virtue of there being not too many students taking courses, and by having him offering, and he had a particular interest in programming, and he also had a woman professor for at least 1 year. I don't remember how long she was there. It was not the whole time, but she taught programming also. And that was, because there were so few students, it was almost like a personal computer in many ways. I could go in anytime to the computer room and have access to the IBM 1620. And when I became a senior, when I was a senior project, I did a compiler basically for that machine, so I spent a lot of hours programming. And having access to the hardware and having it was a natural part of the courses, which was not usual at that time period.
So what was the compiler that you wrote?
Well, it was basically kind of a dialect of Fortran. So for some reason, IBM was, with the 1620, distributed the source code for their Fortran compiler. So I didn't have a course in compilers, but I went through, I kind of reverse engineered the Fortran source code and had different syntax and different statements. So like a variation on the if statement, and so it was not a wholly different language, but it was sufficiently different that I had to redo all the parsing and everything in the compiler. And so I learned something about compilers basically by reverse engineering the source code and redoing it for a new language. So it was essentially a Fortran variation.
So that was your senior project.
Yeah.
Did you write a report about that, or?
Probably, I don't actually remember. I suppose I probably had to give a presentation on it. I don't remember that there was a little bit of a user's manual, but I don't think there was a report.
So were there any instructors at university for those? You did it fairly the standard 4 years.
Yeah.
Of your bachelor's degree. Were there any faculty members who were significant in helping you see your vision for where to go besides the president who had brought in this computer? And I don't know how much influence he had directly.
The key person was the math the math department chair.
Okay.
Who taught most of the courses, and brought in the computer and integrated it into the classes, and then made it available also for students like me. And I wasn't the only person that was influenced by this, but I think there have been PhDs in computer science, for about one student every graduating class, and there were like 5 or 10 graduating math students, so it turned out a very high proportion of PhDs in computer science. The other professors who were influential were largely liberal arts, because this was a liberal arts college. So I took science courses, chemistry and biology, but it was maybe the literature courses were, the professors in the literature courses were almost all female that I took, as far as I remember. And they were just, good courses.
Do you want to share the name of the math professors or any of the others?
Robert Wilson was the name of the math professor, and he's still alive, and I think. And I've run into his son at various times in my career, and I don't remember the name of the female professor. I haven't thought of those names for a long time.
So as you finished your bachelor's, what were your plans?
Well, kind of for lack of anything else, and not having much of a sense of what the job market was like, I decided to go into graduate school, and I went to University of Michigan. They had the closest. Now, there weren't computer science departments in universities at that time, so there wasn't a natural progression there, and and math in graduate school was not what I wanted to do. I wanted to do more computer science, and so University of Michigan had a computer and communication sciences program, which was very broad. It was like, it had speech, it had physiology, it had some automata theory. John Holland who's famous in complex systems, taught some sort of a course. This was pretty far out stuff, but I didn't really want to go on in that either. And I had an automobile accident at that time also, so I was injured and recovering from that. So I basically stopped with a master's degree at University of Michigan, and then I got a job sort of instructor at University of Massachusetts, and then after that I went back. By then, computer science departments had come into existence, and so I went back to Carnegie Mellon.
So how long were you a lecturer or an instructor at University of Massachusetts?
About a year and a half.
Teaching math, or?
It was just the beginning of computer science there. Yeah.
So this must have been around 66, 67?
Yeah. So that was about the time that the first textbooks on programming languages were coming out, and automata theory as well was becoming an established field.
So your exposure to automata theory was at University of Michigan. So is that when you really started becoming aware of the discrete math side of mathematics?
Well, actually, probably going back into college. There weren't discrete math courses. Everything was calculus and differential equations, but it may have actually gone back to high school with the math professor there who tried to teach us set theory, and or at least that was a part of one of the math courses, like a junior-senior math course. And then also during college, I was a summer assistant at some more National Science Foundation funded institutes that were taught there at the college. So I was like a teaching assistant. Of course, I had to learn this stuff too, and it wasn't being taught in my college courses. So I think that there was a set theory course that was taught at that time in the summer institute in which I was a teaching assistant.
Okay, so finish at Wesleyan, go to University of Michigan until you're sort of forced to stop there because of the recovery from the accident.
Yeah.
Taught for about a year and a half at University of Massachusetts. You gained some experience. It sounds to me as if you understood you needed to go on, that there was more to do with your education. So can you talk about that transition and realization?
Well, it was at that time. Now, we're really tracking, my development is tracking the development of the field in many ways, that it was at that time that you could start to see that there were, publications, and a new field was really taking shape that wasn't math and that wasn't a branch of any of the physical sciences or biological sciences, that it was a distinct field in itself. And because I was in tune with programming languages and compilers, and not operating systems, but above operating systems, compilers and assemblers. That seemed like that kind of defined a path, and so I applied. I was accepted at Stanford as well as Carnegie Mellon, but I went to Carnegie Mellon because it was close. It wasn't Carnegie Mellon at that time, it was Carnegie Tech, because it was within 3 hours of Ohio, where I grew up.
So you left University of Massachusetts and started in graduate school.
Yeah.
Did you have a good idea of a topic yet, or did that develop?
No, I didn't. And at the time that my class, my cohorts at Carnegie came in, for some reason, they decided not to have as many courses. So we had an abstract algebra course that was hard for everybody, and we had more programming languages, which was the main field there at the time, and artificial intelligence, and had a few courses, but not a whole lot of structure to the program. It was the faculty teach what they want to teach. So Nico Haberman came in at that time, and he taught operating systems, and the curriculum kind of got defined by what the faculty wanted to teach, which was okay, but it wasn't as structured and I think maybe as broad or as integrated as it might have been. But we all kind of found our way through. Now, I was hoping to have Alan Perlis as my thesis advisor, and Alan he left to go to Yale at about that time, so I had kind of a disjointed PhD trail. That is, I got started on a couple of things working with him, but they never matured before he left, and by then I kind of picked verification of APL systems, and Don Lublin, who taught logic, got kind of drafted in as my thesis advisor. But Perlis was influential. As people used to say, Perlis has a lot of good ideas, but then Perlis has a lot of ideas, and they're not all good. And I got kind of buffeted around among his many ideas that as to what would be a good thesis topic.
Did you begin knowing that you were in a PhD program, or did you think you might be going
to
a master's?
No, it was definitely a PhD.
Did you earn a master's along the way?
Not in that, no.
Okay.
No, it was, I believe it was pretty much strictly PhD, yeah.
So you were part of a cohort that pretty much followed the same courses together. About how many of you were there?
Probably about a dozen.
And have you kept in contact with many of those folks?
Yes, yeah. So Anita Jones was in, and we were roommates in graduate school and continuous friends, all the way since then. Larry Snyder is at University of Washington, Tim Teitelbaum at Cornell. And I have seen these, people many times over my career, and have watched what they've done.
How many years was your PhD program?
About 4 years. Yeah, 4.5. I think it stretched. Yeah.
And can you tell me anything about the process of developing your research and writing your thesis?
Well, it was pretty painful because Robert Floyd had been there and had left. I think he may have been one of the reasons I wanted to go to Carnegie, and as often happens, you get there and the professor you were interested in is gone. But he had created the field of defined program verification as it was called the verifying compiler, an article that he wrote. And then there had been one thesis in that area, and then I was kind of trying to follow in those tracks, kind of a merger of automated theorem proving and programming languages, and I had been entranced by the language that Perlis was interested in at that time, which was APL. So I took verification of APL programs as my thesis topic, and I thought I would get the union of everybody that was interested in verification and everybody who was interested in APL, and I actually got the intersection, which was me and one guy in Israel and another person somewhere else. It was not an optimal selection in terms of topics, in terms of the APL was an oddball but fascinating language, and remains so today, with things you could do with operators. In my thesis, I had a one-line Hamming encoder program. So it was all APL operators strung together, 26 operators or something like that, to do a Hamming code. And that was the basis for the verification, some of the verifications techniques that I was looking at. But that was an oddball language, and it wasn't particularly interesting to the rest of the verification field either. So, it didn't have much generality to it, I guess is the problem.
You mentioned from very early on this idea of how do you know you've gotten the right answer as a precursor to your interest in verification. Can you reflect a little bit on how you became aware that verification was going to be the area where you specialized?
I think probably Floyd's article on the verifying compiler just brought together a number of ideas there. And there was a cartoon. I don't know whether it was in his article or it came separately, but it was something about somebody was in the first frame of the cartoon was we can now answer this great big question by adding or multiplying, I don't know, some large number of numbers, and then somebody else naively says, but how do you know you got the right answer? And that just struck me as being a pretty fundamental thing to be concerned about. And also very, very hard to answer, because if you're computing something, do you have a different way of computing it? Computing a sum of numbers, do you have a different way of doing it? And Floyd's article was very obscure, but it was clarified later in other work, and I think Jim King's work, the use of assertions, that you have an assertion working through the loop that assures you that you're getting the correct result at the end, mathematical induction.
And so you were at University of Massachusetts teaching, and you were already becoming aware that this was the direction you were going to go. So you were pretty focused as you decided the programs to which you were going to apply?
Well, I just picked the programs that seemed to be most relevant, most interesting, yeah. And it was computer science. By then, computer science was defined.
So this was in the late 60s or early?
Starting 67, I think.
Okay. And it's interesting to me knowing about the computer science education timeline, because curriculum 66 is a defining moment. And then also knowing the Dykstra line and all of the things that were happening in 67 through 71 there. It sounds just like it was an exciting time to be you.
Yeah. In probably around 70 or 71, Dykstra gave a seminar in Albuquerque, hosted by University of New Mexico. And I was able to attend that. So people have been finding out ever since then that they were at that seminar that Dykstra taught. And we didn't know each other, but it was kind of a gathering place where people had similar interest, and Dykstra taught that. I remember at the end of Dykstra's course, he gave us a chance to pose a problem to him, and I can't remember what the problem. It was like organizing a family tree. You get the pairs of parent and child, and you want to organize it into a tree. And we gave him that problem, and he didn't do very well with it. He had never programmed those kinds of algorithms. He had a little trouble finding the assertions.
Interesting.
And it was just not a familiar data structure to him. Well.
Is there anything else from the time when you were a student that you'd like to share?
Well, I think there was one more course that I taught that was influential, and it was philosophy of science, and how. And I wrote a paper on mathematical induction in that course also. And it was kind of and again there was a professor who was fairly young, and it was more the realization that there was structure to theories of science. Science had it wasn't just something going on, that there was structure to it. And I don't think I ever had a strict philosophy course per se. I might have, but I find that area very interesting now when I look back at it, partially because I have a friend at Santa Monica College who's teaching robotics in a philosophy course, and so we talk a lot about the roles of philosophy and religion and mind and things like that are the larger topics. And by having I think having a liberal arts education was critical to how I developed.
I can see it in some of the things we've talked about as well now, in how you're adapting to your vision loss, that has had an important influence as well. So it's interesting to get this filling in some of those parts. So now you've completed your PhD. That was in 71?
I think it was actually 73 that
73.
I had the oral thing.
Okay. And so after that, your career isn't exactly a ping-pong match, but there are parts that are very clearly focused on education and parts that are very clearly focused on research.
Yeah.
I don't know the easiest way to talk about those two aspects, so I'll leave it open to you to start.
Well, yeah, I went from opportunity to opportunity. Not all opportunities turned out, but why don't I just go through chronologically?
That sounds fine.
And then you can pick out, what's interesting there, and I'll try to highlight something there. So after I left Carnegie, I really didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I kind of wanted to go, for some reason, to Canada. I don't know if it was the war or whatever, but I spent a year at the University of Toronto, and that gave me actually much broader exposure to more computer science than I'd gotten at Carnegie. A different, more like a British culture of computer science. Then my thesis advisor, Don Loveland, became the chair at Duke University, and I was hired there. Very standard computer science curriculum developing at that time. I taught, I think, programming methodology became a subfield around then. After 4 years at Duke, I was not having a whole lot of fun, not much social life. I liked North Carolina, but I wasn't having a lot of fun, and one of my graduate students, somebody who'd been a year ahead of me, was working at Information Sciences Institute at USC, and he liked a paper that I wrote on correctness preserving program transformations. Also, at the time that I was at Duke, I had a couple of summer jobs. One was at SoftTech with John Goodenough, and that turned out to produce a paper that really brought a lot of attention to my career. It was a seminal paper. It wasn't all that earth-shaking, but it brought together a whole lot of ideas. So that was on program testing. And program testing kind of fit in with correctness. They were thought to be opposing types of ways of doing things, and I tried to bring them together. And so I also spent a summer at iCase at NASA Langley, where I got exposed to more NASA-type things. But I wanted to have a little more fun in life, and went to the University of Southern California with Information Sciences Institute based in Marina del Rey, and I lived in Santa Monica. And I was in my 30s at that time, and I lived the single Southern California life to the hilt, and developed a relationship there too. One of the things that was neat about Information Sciences Institute was that a lot of the internet work was going on at that time in very early periods. I had a joint seminar between my verification project there and John Postel's program or Internet Protocol project. And John Postel, I think, is one of the key figures in the Internet. He died about 10 years ago, but he was a leader in the developing of protocols. We were trying to merge those two areas, and we did write some papers on protocol verification. So I kind of got in sync with the Internet at that point. Let me stop there and see if you got any questions.
No, this is...
Okay. When I was at ISI, I also got... I was kind of a hot item for a while after the theory of test data selection paper got out there, and the program transformation work. I had a body of papers, publications, and that were pretty interesting to a lot of people. So I got to do some seminars at Newcastle in England, and got more European exposure. Got to go to a lot of the ICSI conferences, and really a much broader and more international set of colleagues.
Had you traveled outside of North America before that?
No. All my European travels were really, for conferences. So Information Sciences Institute, we developed a verification system that was quite elegant, and mainly due to the work of one of the people on the project who just had a flair for very good taste in user interfaces. Now, this was done in Interlist. He later left and became a newscaster. He was not interested in computing, but...
What was his name?
David Thompson. And we had four or five good project there. And I was a project leader. And unfortunately, as will happen with DARPA projects, DARPA-funded projects, the funding shifted to another field, so that came to an end. And, you hate to have a project die.
Absolutely.
But it continued on a little bit. Actually, Dave Musser was the brains behind this, but he had left to go to RPI, and he continued the project, for a while, but eventually it totally died. But it was one of the first demonstratable prototypes. And at one point, in a magical evening, a couple of guys from MITRE who were going around to the verification projects, trying to see if we could verify a security kernel. And Dave Thompson and I and these two guys sat down with our verification system, and we verified this fairly significant little security kernel, some security properties of it. And it was the sort of thing where you just sit down, you got your system together, you get the minds who know something about the project and know about the tool, and we did more in that one evening than I think we've ever done in many projects where you plan and you've got a strategy, you're going to do this part and then that part, you're going to prove this and that. We just sat down and just did it. Just the energy flowed through it. And that gave us another boost because it was a significant technological accomplishment to be able to get through that. So the ISI died, and I went had a contact Nancy Martin at the Wang Institute of Graduate Studies in Massachusetts, and so I ended up on the faculty there for 3 years. So that was a good time, also because this was a Master's of Software Engineering program. There wasn't a software engineering curriculum. Who knew what you taught in software engineering? There weren't any books. We had, we collected papers and used the papers and developed the courses, and much of that curriculum later became the basis for the Software Engineering Institute curriculum. In fact, some of the people went to SEI after the Wang Institute died. And so I spent 3 years there working with projects. And there I became interested in logic programming, which was starting to get hot due to the Japanese 5th generation project. And I learned Prolog, and I actually reprogrammed the verification system from ISI in Prolog and went to Japan actually for one of the 5th generation projects. And to me, that was one of the fascinating and lost treasures of computing, that logic programming, was such a different paradigm. And there wasn't much in the way of object-oriented programming at the time. You had imperative, isn't that what it's called?
Yes.
Imperative programming, just very sequential. We had concurrent programming, and then logic programming, a rule-based approach, which, to me has been lost and could have solved many of the problems. Many of the systems we build now would be built better and more simply with a logic programming or a rule-based approach. And that got me interested then when MCC was formed, the research consortium. And I had a contact with Les Bellotti, who was the head of the software technology program. And so I moved to Austin for several years, about 6 years, 7 years, until software technology program ended in a very, very demoralizing way. I had a project there which was called a transition study. So we put together our own little consortium of about 12 or 13 companies and government agencies, NASA and NSA and Kodak and NCR and digital equipment and organizations who contribute a small amount of money to learn about what was the variation of formal methods at that time. But that project was not able to continue. So then I worked for about 6 months. One of my MCC colleagues put together a project that was an international study. Him, Ted Ralston, Dan Cregan from Canada, who I'd worked with, for quite a while, and me, and we went and did interviews on how formal methods, as they were then called, so the verification term morphed into formal methods, how they were being used in companies. So we talked to Boeing and Alcatel company in France and Lloyd's Register and NASA Center at Goddard, and about 12 different companies. And that was another paper that ended up having a lot of citations because it was a structured empirical study. It wasn't that we did technology things, we just interviewed people. And then I needed a real job, and because that didn't pay very much, and went to National Science Foundation for a year. Nico Haberman, he was the assistant director of NSF, and he hired me to be the division director for what was then, I think it was called CCR then, Computer Computation Research. It was the theory and software engineering programs. And I was at that time, my niece and my brother were living, had started to live with me. My father was also in a retirement home nearby, and I couldn't maintain the Washington contact when I had everything in Texas, all the family in Texas. So I came back and took a job at the University of Houston, Clear Lake, as a director of an institute. They'd been a part of my project at MCC, and I developed a good relationship with somebody from NASA, Bob McDonald, and Charles Hardwick, who was at the university, and so I sort of became the director of this institute. And that was a bad time for NASA with the companies, the space companies coalescing, consolidating into the United Space Alliance or whatever it was, and money going away, and so that died. Then for about 5 years, I worked on my own, developing some search tools, software search tools. Did some consulting, again working with one of the MCC colleagues. But I was also having vision problems at that time. So at the time, just as I was starting the job at University of Houston, Clear Lake, I had a major retinal detachment and surgery and a lot of recovery, and had later vision problems 2 or 3 times. But after a while, my brother and I decided we wanted to get jobs in the same area, and so we happened to pick Arizona, moved to Prescott, where his job is a casino dealer, and I had a job there at Embry-Riddle University for 5 years. And then about 3 years ago, I was fired by Embry-Riddle for lack of, they have ran out of students just like many places, and we were not on very good terms for reasons that related to women who wanted to see the university change, and I was having vision problems, and it was a good time to get out of there in any case. And since then, I've been retired and learning a lot, and continuing to program actually in Java, continuing to develop a student project I started there, a podcatcher.
So in the times that you've been in classrooms and teaching, what have those experiences been like?
Well, if we work backward from the Embry-Riddle time, one of the interesting things is the contrast in how structured, computer science is now compared to what it was when I started out. At the beginning, and you didn't have textbooks and exercises and standard curriculum. You just pretty much had to put together all your own material and, to the best of your knowledge, figure out what the course was about. Now you can, pick up any number of database books, and you can pick among what you want to emphasize, and it's all highly structured material. But I love teaching databases because that covers everything in computer science, from the logic of SQL and operating systems and the concurrency and transactions and ER diagrams that cover software engineering. So, I see the big thing now in computer science is the pick and choose issue. You have so much structured material. It's a matter of what's your choice of topics to emphasize, to use the materials that you have available, to use the textbooks and
Right. Do you have a teaching philosophy that you could share?
I think projects are extraordinarily important. But when I look back at my career, when the project I did in the compiler, and I actually wrote an assembler type instructional assembler project when I was at University of Massachusetts, and I programmed again. These were not programs in teams, but these were individual projects that I had, but that you have to program enough to get into the complexity of the product, that you understand what the technical problems are, and so you have to be working. Now it's mainly working in team projects to do that, which brings a whole different dimension. But the thing I think is lacking in many curriculum is there's too many just small exercises, and you have to have a big enough one to really teach you the complexity, the hard awareness of the complexity issues, as well as to develop your confidence. So once you know that you can start a project and you're going to get into it and it's going to get horrendous, but you have to figure out then how to deal with those problems, and you can believe that you can get to the end of it so that you don't stop. So I believe students need to be given experience where they get into the messes and have to deal with the complexity and make mistakes and fail. Working in teams, I think, is also very important. And I used the what's it called, the team framework that
personal software process.
Not the personal, but
the team software process.
The team software
TSP.
process. I just used the matrix that defined the different roles on teams. So I would, and I did this also at the Wang Institute, in a more informal way, but having defined rules to follow, manager and QA, and try to get the students to not necessarily to go with the role that most matched their personality. So pick, like if somebody is more naturally, like I had Air Force students often at Embry-Riddle, and of course they got rank, and you know who's going to be the leader and the manager. Well, you put the manager in the QA department, so that they learn more about the technical stuff. And you put somebody who may be, not necessarily leader type, but you put them in the manager's role. And sometimes they find out they really hate doing that kind of work or playing that kind of role, and sometimes they really take to it. But they learn some different experiences, from being in different roles. And I did this with the software engineering lab, and then later with the senior projects. So a lot of mix and match types of things where you have the roles defined well enough so they understand what their responsibilities are, and they learn a few techniques, but they also find out whether that's a good role for them going on, and also they understand better when they're working in a team. They're more empathetic about, more understanding of what goes on in a different role.
How has your teaching style changed over the years?
Well, toward the end, I became very much the active, active
learning?
Yeah, active learning. And I'd always been liked, projects versus lecturing. So in discrete math, I would have only about half the period would be lecture on whatever, introduction to the next, the next topic, or covering some of the things, and then send the students up to the board in teams of 1 or 2 or 3, and have them, try to solve problems together with me, going around to coach them. And that backfires on, and I took a course at a SIGC on active learning, and a guy who taught the course warned, he said, nobody knows how to evaluate. They don't know how to evaluate that teaching style. That, your evaluator comes in and sees the students wandering around the room, and are they learning? What's going on? And but I much enjoyed using that for a couple of years, because I think they did learn a lot more. I think I always put more emphasis on exercise, on picking the right exercise and having, some sort of a significant project in the course, and, a sub-part of the course. The database course, you build a little database at the end, and that, rather than trying to cover the subject matter, I would make a judgment as to what was important about, learning, say, databases, and forget the rest of the material. That, their job is not to learn the field of databases in a research sense, but to get some blend of the practical and the theory and as much of the subject matter as you can, but to try to get it put together in some sort of a project. So in terms of change, from the early days, it's probably much more of a dropping of trying to cover less.
Makes sense. Do you have any particular stories to relate about any of your students or any of your classes?
Well, one of the student stories was actually at Embry-Riddle, and we had a project. We got a grant from National Science Foundation on computer security education. This was in their federal cyber corps or something, needing more education in computer security going on. And one of the students and I worked one summer he did the programming. I didn't know Java at the time, but he learned it and did it. We built a buffer overflow applet that you could demonstrate in a computer security course. And we put it on the web, and as far as I know, it's still there and it's still being used. Actually, it's being used more outside the United States than inside the United States. But I learned so much from this student, Jed Crandall, who I think is getting a PhD in computer science from UC Davis. And I've had this experience in a number of times that I like it when I can feel like a colleague to the student. When there's something I don't know but they do know, and we can work together as more like equals in order to complete some project, which, it's usually a project that I've set up, but it's not necessarily that I am the leader, but we are trying to work as co-equals.
Professional organizations. What professional organizations have been significant in your life?
Well, I've been a member of ACM on and off, IEEE on and off. I'm a member of neither right now because I don't read the print publications, and I've kind of lost interest in trying to get the digital versions of it. ACM harmed my career a few times. They published these papers that were anti-verification, and that influenced in the Information Sciences Institute time. It influenced the DARPA funding, and it wasn't that they didn't have the right to make to do the publication. It was that the papers were attacking the field. This was the Fetzer and DeMillo, Lipton, and Perlis papers. They were not reviewed by. They were kind of written in the factual sense when they blended a little bit of what was real and what might be, and they set up straw positions and I just thought they were biased and unfair papers, and I've resented ACM ever since then for that. These papers should have been reviewed more, or had counter, when they were published, had the counterpoints published along with the same time. And the same thing has happened with AI and other fields, but this was my field. So I was member of, the IEEE board for IEEE software, and did a lot of reviewing, but I've never worked much with many of the professional subgroups.
Okay.
I've, on the women's side, I've been involved with sisters since the beginning, since the bathroom.
Yeah.
And
right here in Austin, Texas.
Right here at the Renaissance. And but that's also been on and off in terms of being interested in posting and reading all the stuff. Now I pretty much read all the articles. I was involved with the funding, actually, of Anita Borg when she was trying to get funding, or we had some of the early conferences where we were defining the things that NSF would be doing. And I worked with trying to set some goals there. I was a member of SWE for a while, Software Society of Women Engineers, and one of my students at the Wang Institute, whose name Betty something, is she's the executive director of SWE now. She was the one woman in the Soul of a New Machine book. Was involved in that. She was a hardware engineer, and I've never been loyal to or any particular professional organization.
Has supervising undergraduate or graduate students played much of a role in your career?
Supervising in the sense of projects and student.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And like most recently there at the Wang or at Embry-Riddle, right, with this security education project, we had 3 or 4 students one woman and 3 male students who were worked on the project at various times, and I've always tried to get into the senior project, or to be the supervisor of the senior projects if I could. And I've done that, probably done dozens of those kinds of student projects.
But haven't had much in the way of graduate students?
No. I've never taught in a graduate student program other than the Wang Institute, but that was more along this model of a professional school, not the long-term graduate program.
Right. Okay. Have you spent any time volunteering your professional activities?
You mean like using computing outside of computing?
Right.
Not that much. When I look back at Austin, I was involved with the thing Elaine Rich and the other Elaine set up, the
Twist, Tomorrow's Women in Science and Technology.
It was the Expanding Your Horizon.
Right. So Twist was the umbrella.
Right.
Yes.
And tried to work in that, and I don't really think of many other cases. I've been trying to volunteer my services with respect to accessibility and assistive technology at the place that I live now, but there aren't enough I can't find the organizations that are bringing people together to make the contacts for volunteering.
But I think that your blog is an
Yes.
example of service.
Yes.
That would be interesting to put on the record.
Yeah. Okay. So after basically becoming legally blind in 2006 and fumbling around with a lot of the technology that was available, computing technology that was available, in 2007 I started writing a blog, and I thought, now I'm representative of someone who's very, very tech savvy, and I'm willing to put money out, to pay for the equipment that I need to keep me going, but I'm not a part of the regular rehab system, and things are very structured. So if you're a veteran, or if you are employed, or you want to be employed, or if you're in the educational system, there are rehabilitation services, and that will fund you to get some training. But I'm on my own, basically, learning on my own. And I also think that those organizations, basically by their very nature, are not necessarily going to be as far along in the technology cycles as I am. So I've been trying out different software packages. This works, even if it's a little strange, like a magnifying mouse, a mouse with a magnifier that you can get from Microsoft. It's just a little mouse, but it's got a magnifier that can be useful to you. So I'd write up these little things, kind of thinking of myself as being an advisor to the baby boomers who are going to be losing their vision, want to maintain their technology communication abilities as much as they can, but are not going to have the rehab services. And even if they had the rehab services, they wouldn't necessarily have the same, they wouldn't be given the same span of possible choices as I might be able to give. So I've been trying to write up that experience, and my tagline is adjusting to vision loss using technology with class. And looking at this as an ongoing process of how I change. And the blog is not just about technology, but it's also about a few of the heroes that I've found that are writing books or providing material, and they inspire me. And so I write about them, and I write in a more personal vein than I would if I were doing this. This is not technology papers.
Right. Have you had many opportunities over the years to serve as a mentor?
Well, more to males than to females. When I look back at it, I find it disappointing that I've not had as many female students to work with as males. And it's not just the numbers, but also quality. More of the women that I've had were in my classes, like at Embry-Riddle, were not as committed. I would hate to say this, but not as committed to computer science, but part of it was because they were more interested in other things that were kind of outside my range, like one student interested in computer security, but also in global security and in kind of the cultural aspects as well. So I've felt like I've tried very hard to keep women into computing, but I've seen a couple of cases where the women just felt that they could not compete with the males. You got unlocking the clubhouse, kind of thing. You got a real smart male, and the female feels bad about it, and it's very hard to bolster the female's confidence and keep her involved. So I have not been involved in any of the structured mentoring activities. I don't think.
Are there any particular challenges that you faced in your work environment over the years?
Well, partially because I took the opportunities that came along. You know, I've had been in more failing organizations than I would have liked to. You know, organizations that died, and they died because they were, out of sync with their times, or financial. It just happens, and there are a lot of lessons from that, because when you're going through a period of 1 or 2 or 3 years where the organization is dying on you, or declining student enrollments or declining funding, it affects you personally a great deal. It's hard to keep up your morale when your job is falling apart. At Embry-Riddle, I had real challenges with dealing with male colleagues because of the background of the institution being maybe 7-to-1 students and about the same ratio of faculty, male to female ratio, and a number of women banded together basically to change the situation, trying to make it clear that women were not getting promoted, and women faculty were uncomfortable being excluded from male activities, or feeling that they were not being given the opportunities that were needed, and having to deal with male professors stating that women did not belong in engineering, and other professors saying that the gay student's lifestyle was an abomination. It was their responsibility to change it. And it's not that these people are not entitled to their opinions, but there is a diversity code that's published. And if the diversity code is not followed in some sense, then women who are standing up and trying to get the support of a serious diversity commitment are further harmed by their standing up activities. And in these two cases, the faculty later became chair of the faculty and on the tenure and promotion committees, and things that were I believe unacceptable, would be unacceptable to most women, but these things happen, and when you stand up, you're a troublemaker, and you are a troublemaker, because if you didn't stand up, there wouldn't be any trouble.
Yeah. Sounds like there were some real difficult times there.
Yeah. But it was also a learning situation for myself in terms of I had to decide to what extent I would put myself on the line. If you're at the end of your career, and I know of another woman who's gone through she went through a specific discrimination and retaliation thing, but we've talked about this often. At the end of your career, you can stand up and do things you could not do earlier. And furthermore, you know better. You just have the past history, and you say, this has got to change. And I'm going to see what I can do to make it change, and the harm that might come to me because I'm at the end of my career is not as significant, because it's just got to change. And so the benefits, if I don't stand up now against this, then this will go on. And it's not just me alone standing up with it against it, but others, who are also willing to put themselves on the line. Not just one person, but a group trying to make a change. And it's painful, but it happens. And at the end of your career, you can take some chances you wouldn't otherwise.
Right. So you've talked a little bit about outside familial connections, and especially over the last 15 years with your niece. And you mentioned briefly a relationship in Monterey. So let's turn a little bit to outside of work, outside of research, as we're winding down, and talk about what family and relationships have, how they have influenced your life.
Well, with the raising of working in the raising of the children, now I understand how hard it is for women to maintain balance among family and work, and the benefits of the time that goes into the family. I didn't understand that, when I was younger, and I, for one reason or another, I just never made the choice to have a family. I got one later in life. In terms of friendships, I've maintained a lot through my different jobs, and in terms of male-female relationships, there's been one that's lasted for about 30 years, off and on, and recently, actually, more on than off in terms of as we've grown older and had more understanding, I think, of each other. The fact that I've had vision loss has put me into a totally different world of contacts that have been quite interesting, both from a technology point of view. I've seen a lot of interesting tools that I would never have been able to appreciate, just sort of a kind of technology drive that I think is fun because it's ahead of the where some sighted people are, but also I've made a number of contacts that I would not have otherwise, which seems extraordinarily strange that at a time when I can appreciate much more and relax much more because I'm not in the competition. I'm not a player except where I try to be. I would like to be able to interact more with people, but I can't see their faces, and I have all the awkwardness of the vision problems that now interfere more with developing additional relationships at this point in my life.
A lot of challenges that you wouldn't have thought about earlier, 10 years ago, say.
Yeah.
Are there any other strong outside interests that will help us understand you better?
Let's see. Well, I left out AAUW among the different membership things that I've been involved in, and that's been helpful to me recently, mainly as I get older and I fit more into the AAUW demographics in the place where I live, which is largely retired women, and I'm reading the Age of Turmoil, or by the Greenspan book for my book club tomorrow morning, and much more involved in trying to get involved in group activities, whereas I have no particular domestic interest, baking and so forth, just not captured my interest very much, but more diverse intellectual interest. And if I were able to, I'd be much more involved in nature activities, but I'm much more limited in that domain. I've traveled a lot on nature trips and eco-type trips, Belize and Guatemala and the Galapagos and the Barrier Reef and in Australia, and places that Baja a great deal. When I was younger, I've much enjoyed taking those kinds of excursions.
Fun stuff. If you could give advice to a young woman starting out, what would it be?
Well, when I look at the field, I went to this conference called She's Geeky, which was kind of a spontaneous unconference held in California last October. And I realized there are the very technological and the accidental technologists. And, the accidental technologists many of them are IT administrators, database administrators, and so forth. And that can be a very challenging job. And then there are web designers, and these don't need the same structured approach to computer science as if you're a hardware designer or a software quality or things like that. That when they start in, they need to get as much of the substance as possible, and not get. Don't fool yourself into thinking that because you can build web pages, that's going to be a whole career. That you've got to have a lot more substance, and your career is going to change over time. The technology is going to change over time. Whatever it is you do, whether it's graphic design or the hardware, or you've got to get as much of the substantial courses, and I don't mean computer science theory, but as much of the rigor, the ability to think through and to troubleshoot and to know the technology. Because if you think about people with a job at 25, are they going to be doing the same thing at 35, at 45, at 55, at 65? Well, there are a lot of women at the 65-year range who are doing programming, but many more who will have dropped out. So how are they going to deal with, and they can't anticipate what all those changes are going to be, but they're going to be different people, and there's going to be different technology, and how are they going to make those transitions through different decades of their careers? Well, the main thing I think they have to have is as much substance as they can in whatever aspect of computing they're doing.
Okay. If you could change one decision you've made along your career path, what would it be?
That's a hard one, actually, because every decision that didn't work out so well, I actually tried to make the best of. I think when I made the change from the National Science Foundation to the University of Houston Clear Lake, I did that for family reasons, and I think I needed to have looked more broadly for the job opportunities. At that point, I was around 50 at that point, because that meant significantly less income over the last 15 years of my life, my career life, where I would have had more benefits available to me. I mean, I had a lot of trade-offs at that time, and a vision accident that happened at that time. But I should have. I rushed into a decision, and I should have looked at more organizations, a broader set of organizations. At that point, now looking back at it, I would be much more looking at nonprofit types of opportunities.
And your career now has turned more in that direction. That's sort of interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So as we wind this up, is there any story that you want to tell so that it's going to be remembered?
Well, you mean a specific story or
It's up to
a
you.
general kind of a...
Anything you would like to add?
Kind of a thing. Okay. Well, I think for some reason in my career, I wanted to get experience in all different types of work. I wanted to be in industry or close to industry, sort of industry. I wanted to be in government, and I've become much more interested in that, in government. And I wanted to be in academia, but I never wanted to be in any one of these things my whole life. And so that the ability to go back and forth in these has been very, very broadening, and I think people need to think about doing similar kinds of things to get as broad a kind of experience, even though they're going to work in organizations that fail and they're going to work in places they hate. The broader experience in the long run works well for you. But the other story is, I look back to 1961 and my first programming, and I still love to program. I'm learning Python and Java, and that, if people have got to get hooked into something that they want to keep coming back to. And for me, that's programming. And to have that, the joy of being able to write a program, even if it's not good to much anybody else but yourself, but to be able to plan it through and get it done and have something, that's usable, and, the experience along the way, as well as seeing the product, is something I would wish that everybody would have that chance.
Very good. Well, in closing, I just want to have on the record that you were one of the people who helped spark the Computing Educators Oral History Project, 2003 in Reno, Nevada. Barbara Owens remembers you walking up to her and saying, you have to capture those stories. Do you have any memory of that just to end with?
Yeah.
Anything to add?
Just that Barbara was at that meeting. I think she was introducing or giving an award to Harriet Taylor from NSF, and I had sort of forgotten. I've met Barbara before when I was here in Austin, and we've been in college together. And just I don't know what made me think about that, except for the fact that it was maybe the Harriet Taylor thing that made me realize that there were a lot of stories to be told, and nobody seemed to be interested in women of our age. And there's the ENIAC pioneers, and of course everybody's interested in the World War II and that age of women. But we were the women who were our careers were paralleling much of the history of computing as it was developing, and there had to be some kinds of interesting stories there, and I'm sure glad you guys are carrying it on.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. This has been great.
So,
appreciate it.